Hi, this is Catherine. This is Taking Tea with Catherine. How are you? This is a Simpson and Vale tea blend, an herbal tea blend called Cedarburg Harvest. Cedarburg, I believe it's called. And it is a green rooibos with flower bits and fruit bits. And it's nice. I think it would be good at iced and also warm. So it is good for any time of day, if you like. But definitely something you could drink in the evening. And it sounds kind of autumnal, which I thought was fitting, even though it's not there yet. The weather in New York is still mildly not mild enough for me. But I'm trying not to rush into wanting it to go into autumn, because the sooner it does, the sooner it will turn into winter, which is a time period that I don't really do well with anymore. But that's okay. You know, but I can enjoy myself either way. I just don't like summer either. I am such a picky person, but it's not that I don't like it being warm. I just don't like it when it gets really hot and humid. And it's been, I mean, you can tell I'm a little frizzy. You know, don't care for that. I like to be able to not feel sticky and gross when I'm going through my day. However, it's not been terrible, and August had some really nice days. I tried to take advantage of that when I could. But I also had some really nice reading experiences for the month of August. And I only finished, one of these days I'm going to make a video about numbers and getting obsessed with that. But I only finished 4 books, which doesn't really speak to how many books I was actually reading. I still have a lot of books going, and that is okay either way. The books I finished are the ones I'm going to talk about today. They were good. Some better than others. I don't think it was a stellar reading month in terms of, wow, my life has been changed by this reading, but that's okay too, because again, I didn't not enjoy my reading. So let's talk about the books. I don't know if I'm going to do it in any particular order, but this is a book that I took out. I was having one of those days on Pinterest, and then they, you know, I guess whatever I was looking at, they said, oh, now I got an itchy nose. They said, something along the lines of, you know, recommend this because you look at this. You know how they do that. I don't know if they specifically say that on Pinterest. Anyway, so I saw this book and I said, oh, how cute. Let me see if it's in the library, because I'm not going to buy it. And I took it out of the library and read through it really fast. And I said, well, you know, I'm glad I didn't buy it. No offense to the writer, because, you know, there is definitely a market for this. But it's a cute book. It's called Cottagecore Simplified, A Guide to Countryside Charm, Comfort, and Happiness by Katie Merriman. There it is. Right, it's really cute, and it's a small book, and I do love a naked hardback. I love the whole, is that what they call it? Yeah. And I love that there's a teapot in the middle. I mean, there is somewhat up my alley. I've always liked a lot of aspects of the cottagecore aesthetic and lifestyle, if it's such a thing. I guess it is for some people. Not 100%, but I know during like the COVID days when I was, you know, spending most of the time in an apartment, much as I don't mind that per se, I made the best of it. But, you know, I was kind of missing being out amongst trees and, you know, flowers and whatnot. And I did start daydreaming about living in a cottage and having my own garden and stuff. And then I, you know, got a little more realistic. But the whole cottagecore look and those little posts that you'd see on social media did fuel the daydreams. So, and then of course there's other aesthetics. I never understand these little, they used to call them subcultures. They don't call that anymore, because I don't think that's what it is really anymore. But these kind of titles and things are necessarily anything that anyone should embrace 100%. You could like it. You could use it for inspiration, which is what I look at these books for. I say, oh, something about that is appealing. I'm going to read about it. I'm going to look at this page. I'm going to follow this or whatever. But I never understand when someone completely gets overwhelmed by it. And I don't think that it's necessary to. I'm rambling for such a small book. The point is, it was sweet. It was nice. It tells you different things about how to make your home cozy, for instance, and how to maybe make things smell good and make it cozy. Like I said, cozy already. Blankets and whatnot, different hobbies you can have, some of which are very accessible to many people. And of course, reading is always a thing, so that never hurts. Baking. That, you know, a lot of the things that I actually did during the pandemic. Maybe that's why I started getting annoyed, because then it started to remind me of that time, and who needs it. But I liked it though anyway, and like I said, I'll look at these things online and just have a little escape moments here and there. But then a lot of it was, okay, here's some advice, but then here's how to make your social media about this, you know? So how to design Instagram, I guess Tumblr, is it still a thing? TikTok, you know, whatever you do, to go with this title, with this, label. And okay, nice, but you know, why does everything have to be about, and I know this is I'm doing a, you know, YouTube channel, so that's technically social media. I'm not against it per se, but why is everything so centered on not just doing something, but having to show that you did it? You know what I mean? To a point, yes. I have embraced a lot of that, but I also think sometimes can we just do things for ourselves? And just, if we're going to take a picture and show it to people, just occasionally do it, not have to work so hard at like, oh, let's go on a picnic. Oh, but we got to make it look good because we got to, you know, pose it a certain way. And I said this once in a blog post before I'd heard all these cores and things. I remember going to I think I mentioned this before, going to a well-known matcha place. And I like, you know, it's tea, so, and I went, and it took me a little while to get a seat, but once I did, it was, you know, it was nice. I had plenty of time to myself, but there was someone sitting next to me, these two girls, and they were, you know, seemed pleasant enough, except they just didn't stop taking pictures of their items. And sometimes they were leaning a little bit into where I was sitting. I was like, you know, just enjoy yourself. Have a good conversation. I know people make businesses out of these things, so I can't completely be against it. But, oh, I'm rambling and ranting again. But yeah, so my point is that sometimes we do things. We make videos, we edit them so that it could be enjoyable to watch for people. Some people do make some kind of living or supplement their living to these things. So I understand if that's why they want to learn how to do it right. But again, put yourself into it if you're going to do that. Yeah, you can take advice, but in the end of the day, you're just doing what everybody else is doing. And that can be a little, you know? So, so I don't know, maybe I overthought that, but let me know what you think. So turning to a different type of life, the royal life, I read a biography of the Queen Mother. When I say the Queen Mother, I think most people know I'm talking about the mother of Queen Elizabeth II, who lived until she was 101 years old, which is quite a long life. And I mean, she lived longer than her daughter did, and her daughter lived a pretty long life. But this is a shorter biography than other ones, and that to me was sufficient. It was by the writer Gareth Russell, who wrote Young and Damned and Fair, which was a biography of Catherine Howard, which I really thought was good. So I figured, okay, let me try another one of his books. And I have started some of his other books, and I thought they were good, but then I just wasn't in that mood for those particular books. There's one about Hampton Court Palace, which I do want to read again, or get back into reading it, because it did seem interesting. And then there was one about the Titanic, which, I don't know, I just wasn't feeling at the time. So I wasn't sure if I was gonna feel it with this one, but I was rewatching some episodes of The Crown, so I thought, let me see what she was possibly really like. So this is the book. Dude, let's have another drink. She was well known for being a drinker, and not that I want to encourage drinking per se, but it is possible to live to 101 years old and be a heavy drinker, apparently. I mean, she outlived her husband by like half a century, which is pretty amazing, but he had a lot of pressures and troubles. So when I've watched The Crown, which is where I've seen her depicted the most, she comes across as first kind of almost, well, first grieving that her husband died, then petulant almost, I feel like. Almost like upset that her daughter has this big responsibility when it was her job to do so many things. She was supporting her husband so much, and she would just kind of interfere and make snarky remarks sometimes to her daughter, even though the Queen loved her, but she was still a little, you know, not always nice about things. And then, of course, you know, interfering very much with Prince Charles at the time, before, obviously long before he was king, with his marriage or whatever. And I don't know how much of that is true or how much of that is drama, but she came across as a little bit of not the most positive person on the show. Not like the villain of the program, but certainly not the hero. This book was slightly lighthearted about her. I mean, you could tell by this title and this look. She wasn't, you know, it wasn't this like an exposure of the queen mother and how terrible she was or anything like that. In the beginning, I was like, okay, so she has this quite privileged lifestyle. It almost reminded me of reading something by Nancy Mitford, you know, people who just have all kinds of money and live, you know, she had a nice big place in Scotland, which I believe was supposedly the setting that Shakespeare used for Macbeth. And so that was pretty cool, actually. But at first I said, oh man, she's got this charmed, spoiled life. She's got everything going for her. This is going to be annoying. I know it sounds mean, right? And then I realized, wait a minute, no one has that. No one has that. And then World War I starts out. And before World War I think she already lost one of her siblings, got sick and died. So it wasn't a perfect life. And so I started to dial down the snark. And she had some losses in her family, and some people who didn't actually die from World War I maybe were affected very badly by PTSD, and that had a bad effect on them for the rest of their life if they lived long enough. So I did realize that no, this was not a perfect life. And then she came out of, so she was born in 1900, so it's always easy to figure out how old she was at each time. So she came out of World War I and the Spanish influenza and everything, and started to go out, you know, debutante situation where they used to be presented to the king and queen, very Downton Abbey. And eventually, you know, she has suitors and everything. And yes, eventually she marries the Duke of York, who was definitely not at that point supposed to be the next king of England. But then, sorry about that. And then, you know, it talks about how she got along with the rest of the family, and it wasn't too bad. Her in-laws, I mean. And then, of course, eventually her brother-in-law becomes the king, and then he quickly abdicates. So that leads into a massive change in her life and her husband's life and her daughter's life. So they go into that, and then, of course, the rest is history, going through World War II, losing her husband, her daughter being the queen, what she did after that. And there were things I hadn't known about, like in the 1960s, she had cancer. And obviously she survived it, but this was not covered in The Crown, and it might have made her a little more sympathetic. Maybe I'm wrong, but man, you know, like, seriously. But so most of the time, and I should have said earlier that they used, there were chapters of different times in her life, but every bit, every section was one, like, short or long essay almost on having to do with a part of her life, and it was 101 of them, so one for each part of her life. And some of them were really fun, little funny things that happened, and her sayings that were kind of witty, and how she could drink people under the table. And other times there were things that I didn't like about her, like, for instance, one time, I guess she was a bit older, when her grandson, the then Prince Charles, had a dog that got out and was lost and feared falling into some hole or something. And Charles was very upset about this, and she was a little dismissive of his upset feelings. And they said, well, maybe she had dealt with so much loss in her life that to her this was not a big deal. But I'm like, no. Be nice. Someone loses their pet, their dog. It's so messed up to feel that way. But in general, she came out looking okay in this story, and it was a charming enough book. Like, it wasn't, I didn't feel like Gareth Russell was falling over himself to make her look perfect. He brought out flaws, and of course, and they do bring out some interesting things that were brought out on the program too, like the fact that there was types of I guess you call it mental illness or something on her side of the family that they kept really hush-hush because it could look bad, you know. So that was a little, I don't know, nowadays they still probably do that to a point, but they try to also bring out certain things to make people relate to them. I don't know. The royal family is not that relatable no matter what you do. You know, there's always, I have such a love-hate relationship when it comes to the royal family. I find them interesting, lots of drama and everything, but then at the same time, not exactly, I mean, you know, no matter what kind of ups and downs they have, there's still quite a lot of privilege. But I did find some interesting bits. One of the parts that I found most interesting for some reason was that after her brother-in-law, who was, you know, the one who abdicated, the Duke of Windsor, and he is notorious for not just giving up the throne for the woman he loved, or so he said, but also having some kind of relationship with the Nazis. Not a great look. However, a while after he died, she one day was, I don't remember if it was in Paris or wherever it was, that Wallis Simpson, whatever her name was at the time, the wife of him, her sister-in-law, I guess you could say, she actually went to visit her. And I did not know this. Maybe she was trying to bury the hatchet, or at least just be whatever. And her caretaker said that she was indisposed and they didn't see her. And there's a whole story about that has been known, that it's possible that this caretaker was in some sort of abusive situation or some kind of mistreatment. I don't know the whole story, but I found it interesting that she even made that attempt, because she didn't have to. So, you know, I would say, if you have any kind of interest, if that show The Crown was interesting to you, if you like reading biographies of people but you don't want something too in-depth, if you like reading about basically the entire 20th century, you know, give it a shot. But otherwise, nothing groundbreaking, just good enough. Anyway, so I'm feeling particularly like I'm being really ranty and snarky about everything, and I don't mean to sound that way, but I may sound a little bit like this again in the next book. And that is My Life with Bob, Flawed Heroine Keeps Book of Books, Plot Ensues by Pamela Paul. So this is a book about books, which is one of my favorite things. And I have heard people talk about this on BookTube, and it was pretty positive, so I thought, okay, I've got to get to this. I got it long time ago. I say a long time ago, probably around 2020, when I was ordering from an outlet. And I used to get a whole box full of books, and it was fun, you know, great dopamine hit. I've tried to tone down on doing those kind of orders nowadays, because, I mean, if you look in the background, lots of books don't need more. But at the time, I got this book, and I was saying to myself, okay, one day I'll read it when I'm in the mood. And I was in the mood. I saw it, and I said, I haven't read a book about books in a while, or in a minute, I don't know. But I didn't realize exactly what it was. I thought it was going to be a lot more about the book journal and a book of books. I thought that, I don't know why. And her book journal is something she started when she was a kid. She's a little bit older than me, so she, you know, grew up in the 70s and 80s. And most of this book is just mentioning which book she read. So it was like, okay, the name, the author, when it was finished, usually, possibly, and that was it. I didn't know that it wasn't a more in-depth journal, like, okay, talking about books, like the way I'm ranting now, like some kind of coverage of what the book was about, or what it meant to her, or whatever. And so I was disappointed about that, but I thought, let me read on, and parts of it were pretty interesting. She grew up in the New York area, so for me, there were slightly some relatable moments. She talked about going to a bookshop in Roosevelt Field Mall, which I am pretty sure I went to with my grandparents once, and they bought me one of the Ella Montgomery books. More on that later. So there were happy moments like that, and there were some kind of hijinks moments, like her time in France, when she was in some kind of student program and she thought she was going to have some really awesome French adventure, and then it was just some really out of the way, unrecognizable place that had no charm, and it was just, and then she spoke about the books that she read at the time, and each chapter had a book, and maybe how it a book she had been reading around that time and how it had an effect on her. So I guess this is more of her book journal than anything, a book memoir. And I didn't hate that. There were some really good moments, like when she talked about being in school and the way people would talk about literature, this whole almost showing off sort of way, and finding hidden meanings that weren't there or didn't seem to be there. And I was like, oh, you're speaking my language, because I used to get frustrated sometimes in school when I would just enjoy a book and people would dissect it to death. So that was good. But then there were just parts I didn't understand, like when she was done with college, how she just decides, that's it, I want to do something different, I'm moving to Thailand. And it didn't really make much sense why she did that. And then she went over to, I think, China, and then she read a book about the Cultural Revolution, and she decided to sort of go on a hunger strike for a while, and I just didn't get it. And then she was getting into some of her relationships, including marriages, and I don't know, I wasn't feeling it too much personally. I think I was kind of annoyed. This is a Catherine thing, because she married someone, moved to London with them for a while, and her husband was very allergic, so she just gave up her cats, she said, to strangers. And I guess that meant bring them to a shelter. And I was like, you gave your cats away. I know people do that. And some people have to do that. But I was just like, So, I don't know. I wasn't completely in love with the book, but I didn't hate it. It was a good enough book about books. I don't think it's one that I would say was my top book about books. It had its moments. It was of a time period that I am interested in. Again, kind of just a little bit earlier than me. She grew up just a little bit, so it's kind of nice to look back to those times a little bit. So yeah, not horrible. There were parts that I was really engrossed in and parts that I just didn't get. So that was me. But the last book that I read, and this month, and speaking of L.M. Montgomery, was a book that somehow I had never read of this author. I was obsessed with Anne of Green Gables, and I read a lot of other of Montgomery's books. This one, I just didn't. And the thing is, and I'm not going to get into the ending, but when there was a part in the ending that I really remembered, and I have to think that I must have heard my sister definitely read this book, and she used to read out loud a lot. So I think I might have just heard it, and so I remembered it, because I definitely wouldn't have just imagined this. It really sounded very familiar. But that's Emily of New Moon. I can't believe it took me this long. I didn't have a copy of this. I have the other two books in the trilogy, which I just started one of them now that I finished this one. And it was another book about orphans, or an orphan, and which is Emily Bird Starr. She is, her father and mother eloped, and her mother came from a slightly proud family in Prince Edward Island called the Murrays. And so when she eloped with this, not very wealthy, or I mean, not that the Murrays were wealthy, but journalists, and so it was a little bit of a problem in the family. And then her mother died young, and then her father died young, consumption. And so now Emily has to live with one of her relatives. So she lives with her Aunt Elizabeth, her Aunt Laura, and her cousin Jimmy. And Aunt Elizabeth is very kind of stern, not quite Marilla of Anne of Green Gables, but in a similar sort of no-nonsense way about her. Aunt Laura is a little more sympathetic, and cousin Jimmy is slightly eccentric, and he had sustained an injury by Aunt Elizabeth earlier in life, so she, out of guilt, kind of lets him get away with a lot of things. And so Emily gets used to living in a different situation, and gets to make friends in school, and gets to meet a whole bunch of people, and starts to get into wanting to write books. Well, really, at first she wants to write poetry, and she wants to write stories, etc. And so it's about that, and it's interspersed with her writing letters to her father, who's dead, but she wanted to write to him. So you have these letters that are badly spelt until she gets a dictionary, and I really liked it. It was there was a little interspersed, like, not fantasy, but like a little bit of fancy, whimsical bits about it, in which, like, for instance, she has pointed ears, so people like to say that she's, a fairy, or part fairy, or whatever, and so that always affects certain people. And she does seem to have certain things, like she gets the flash, which is this sort of feeling, almost like inspiration, but like a sort of happiness feeling. But apparently, Lucy Maud Montgomery had those flashes, so really it's semi autobiographical. And I enjoyed it. I mean, there were times where people like would kill animals for no really good reason, and that never makes me happy. I'm not like, you know, all obsessed with animals to that point. I am a meat eater, but you know, just, you know what I mean? Like nowadays we spay and neuter our pets if we don't want them having, you know, kittens, puppies, whatever. But back then, if your cat had kittens, if you kept any of them, you kept some, and then you drown the rest. Oh, you know, it's just, I know that's how they kept the population down, but just, you know, things like that. And there is a character, and I don't want to get into spoilers, who I don't know what he's going to be like in the future books, but sort of a love interest, I think, but in a way that creeps me out a little bit. So I'm not sure how I feel about that. But I think this was my favorite book of August. It made me want to keep reading, and it just had the beautiful descriptions of nature and feelings that I forgot about. You know, I started reading again some of the Anne of Green Gables books back in 2020, and it was just as great as I had remembered them. But this reminds me that, yeah, I've got to get back to reading. Well, I already have then. And so it was pretty nice to get to read this book. Anyway, so that was my reading. I thought I wasn't gonna have a lot to say, but I was in ranty, snarky, sniping mode. Let me know if you had any particular highlights in August of what you read, and if there's any of these books that you read, and if you agree with my sentiments or disagree, and if you what do you think of these kind of aesthetic things? I'm possibly a little too old for them anyway, although I do believe that sometimes, as long as you don't let it take over your life, sometimes having these little things aren't necessarily bad, no matter how old you are. But that is up to you to give your opinion as well. So that's all for now. I will hope to get back again with another video soon instead of waiting for about a month. But for now, this is Catherine taking tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day. Bye.